Welcome, everyone, and thanks for attending this breakout session. My name is Kim Finnerty. I'm a senior consultant on the Total Economic Impact team at Forrester, and I'm going to walk you through a study that we conducted for Microsoft a few months ago, where we take a look at quantifying the value of using Azure VMware Solution, or AVS for short. To set expectations, I'll start by giving you a brief overview of what a TEI study is, and then I'll share the top-line findings. We'll dive into a summary of what Azure VMware Solution customers told us when we interviewed them, and then I'll walk through the details of the benefits and costs that we quantified in those interviews to arrive at the return on investment we're projecting. I want to start, though, with a bit of a disclaimer. This presentation is a very abridged version of the full TEI study. That document really includes a lot more detail on the assumptions and the calculations that make up the financial model we created. It also provides more of a context, right, for the use cases and real life experiences and results that the customers talk to us about. So I encourage you to follow the link on here, and I'll put it up again at the end of the presentation, and that will take you to the study, and you can get in, explore it for yourself, and start to use it as the basis of your own business case. So all that said, what is TEI? Total Economic Impact is a methodology that Forrester has been using now for over 20 years to help IT and business executives understand the potential financial impact of their technology investments, and to go ahead and create business cases to justify them and get the money they need in their organizations. It's really the gold standard in the industry right now for this purpose, and we do hundreds of these studies every year. We go beyond looking just at the total cost of ownership. We try to quantify the business benefits that the organization can experience. We're also identifying some of the ways that the product can continue to deliver value in the long term. And then we risk adjust all those financial projections to maximize their reliability. The methodology we use is very consistent and thorough. We begin by speaking with the vendor's internal stakeholders. So in this case, it would be product people, salespeople, technical people, and we're talking to them to really understand exactly what kinds of benefits they believe their product is delivering and how they think it's doing that. We also review the Forrester research that's been done by our analysts on the space and the vendor and its competitors. And we involve a Forrester analyst throughout the whole project. In this case, it was Bill Martorelli, who you may have read his research, you may have worked with him before. While we interview a fairly limited number of users for the case study, the analyst is interacting constantly with virtually all of the competitors in the space, as well as with their customers. So they have a really in-depth understanding of the technology and how customers are using it and benefiting from it. That really lets them add valuable insight into our assumptions and what we're hearing from customers to help us create the financial model. And again, make sure that the study is really reliable and useful for you. We then go ahead and actually conduct those customers' interviews. We talk to them in depth. They're anonymous interviews, so people don't have to worry about, giving away their company's financial information or anything. People can be and are quite frank with us. It's just Forrester and the customer on the call, so we know that we're getting unbiased feedback. And in those interviews, we really spend time digging into how the technology has changed their processes and their results. So for instance, how much less time does it take now for people to accomplish tasks? How much higher of a conversion rate are we getting on e-commerce sales? How much incremental revenue can we generate by introducing a product 3 months faster? Those kinds of questions. And finally, we use the data that we collect from those interviews to create a financial model and project the business impact on the organizations. I'll talk a bit more about that process as we walk through the results, but to give you a top line right up front, when we use this methodology to evaluate the impact of Azure VMware Solution, we found it provided a 298% ROI, or in other words, for every dollar invested in deploying AVS, the customer gets back $3.98. AVS delivered a 3-year net present value of $7.93 million, and it paid back on the investment in less than 6 months. There are a number of reasons for this, and we'll explore some of them in the next few pages. But one of them was articulated really clearly by the Assistant Director of Development for a government agency in Europe when she pointed out how much it would have cost them to run their census models if they hadn't been able to move to the cloud so quickly. She said, when you're doing machine learning, you need enormous CPU power, huge processors, lots of memory. If we hadn't used Azure VMware Solution to work in the cloud, we would have had to buy very powerful, very expensive machines to do the machine learning processes, and we wouldn't even use them most of the time. So those kinds of interviews were done with these folks in order to quantify the costs and benefits that are associated with AVS. We spoke with representatives from organizations that have been using the solution for at least a year. So they have seen some results and they understand, what the longer term impact is going to be for their organizations. There are people who probably share titles with many of you who are listening, roles like Senior Director of IT Operations or Director of Technology Delivery. These were the people who were responsible for bringing AVS into their organizations or who work with it extensively in their day-to-day jobs. So they can provide those kinds of hard numbers I talked about before regarding the business impact that it's had in their organization. They worked at companies whose size, as you can see on the bottom line here, size ranged from the tens of millions of dollars to over $50 billion. These organizations were based in countries all around the globe. They covered a number of different verticals, so government, healthcare, technology, and manufacturing. They were all, as you can see, very different kinds of organizations, all giving us their perspective on this same technology. Now, despite how different these organizations were, we found when we spoke with them that they had a number of challenges or pain points in common before they deployed AVS. I'm betting some of these are going to sound familiar to you as well. First, they needed to move to the cloud and quickly. The reasons for this varied. In some cases, they felt that they were at a competitive disadvantage and they really needed to make a change and get up to speed. Others were approaching the end of the useful life of their equipment. So they were at that point where they either had to migrate or make a decision to start that CapEx process to replace and upgrade all of that equipment. In the second place, the costs of their current infrastructure were growing. So they were spending more and more on maintaining and refreshing old equipment, spending more for extended security updates, and a host of other costs related to that on-premise infrastructure. They were also seeing growing issues with their application availability and performance, which was affecting both internal users as well as external customers. And although they were interested in moving to the cloud, they had little access to the kind of talent that could really help them modernize their applications to move to a native Azure or even another cloud-based environment. So based on those pain points they were feeling, the folks we talked to were looking for a solution that would let them experience the benefits of being on the cloud as quickly as possible, while still allowing them to maximize the investment they had already made in their VMware infrastructure, processes, and personnel. Many of them, although not all, did plan to modernize at some point in the future, but they wanted to be able to do that at their own pace, in their own way, and to minimize the disruption to their business, as described here by this global director of IT services at a manufacturing company. He said, using standardized IT platforms for core business processes is critical to us. When we migrated our VMware workloads to the cloud at the corporate level, we didn't want to put them on a different platform from our plants and offices around the world. With Azure VMware Solution, we got the benefits of the cloud while still maintaining VMware as our standard platform. So now we come to the creation of the model and the financial projections you saw at the beginning of the presentation. In the last couple of slides, you can see I was able to weave the anecdotes and the stories that the interviewees had shared with us to create a single narrative about the impact of AVS on their organizations, on all of them. That's not so easy when we're talking about the numbers and metrics that they shared. That's because the organizations did differ so much in terms of their size, their geography, their industry. Some of them were talking in euros, some of them were talking in dollars. Some of them had huge budgets, some of them had small budgets. So the way that we resolve this issue is to create what we call a composite organization. It's a stake in the ground, a fictional company that represents both the organizations participating in the study and can also represent the organizations whose employees are going to be reading and using the study, like you. So the financials I'm going to show throughout the rest of the presentation then are all based on this company. It's a $5 billion revenue company with 10,000 employees, of whom 15 are IT system administrators maintaining the VMware workloads. It's a global company and it's headquartered in North America. It'll be scaling up to 12 nodes in Azure over the 3 years that we look at as the standard time frame for a TEI. Now, I'm sure this company looks very different from yours. You may be bigger or smaller. You may have a more or less extensive VMware footprint. The beauty of the full study that I recommended you download at the beginning is that it includes the tables that have all the detailed calculations and assumptions we used. So you can basically use your organization's size and details rather than the ones for this organization. And you can redo those calculations to get a more customized set of numbers for you to use in your own business case. So back to the composite organization. What we quantified based on the answers and stories we heard in the interviews was that this $5 billion company would realize $10.6 million in benefits in the 3-year period after deploying AVS. We identified 4 major types of quantifiable benefits, and I'm going to walk through how we arrived at these numbers next. But on a top-line basis, the 4 are, first of all, improved application performance and availability, which delivered $4 million in value to the organization. Secondly, the composite organization saved over $5 million in total cost of ownership by moving from on-prem to the cloud. Third, they saved another $1.2 million because they avoid having to hire additional new employees or reskill their current workforce, because it's really a seamless transition from one version of VMware to another when they migrate to the cloud. And finally, a huge reduction in their maintenance costs saves an additional $317,000. So let's dig into each of these a little bit more. I'm going to go into a bit of detail on this first benefit of improved application performance and availability, so I can walk you through the kind of tables that are in the study. I won't go through all the calculations with the other benefits, but I'll share the tables so you can see that this same level of detail is available for those calculations as well. Now, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the table, you're going to see the 3-year present value of $3,997,370. This is the value that I showed on the previous page, although I did round it up to 4 million. So let's walk through the table a little bit. In row A1 at the top, you can see that based on our interviews with the customers, we've projected that the $5 billion composite organization would have 10 priority 1 incidents per year before moving to the cloud with AVS. And on row 2, we're estimating that each of those incidents would cost $250,000 per hour. That's a fairly standard industry number. It's based on lost revenue, operational problems downstream, customer frustration, engineering time to investigate what's going on, etc. On A3, we've estimated, again, based on the interviews, that the average P1 incident would last about an hour and a half. So when we multiply all that out on A4, we see that before the AVS move, the composite organization would have lost $3.75 million each year due to availability and stability issues. Customers told us, and you can see one example in the quote from the healthcare participant, that these incidents were virtually eliminated once the workloads were running on AVS. To be conservative, we've assumed that the organization migrates workloads over time. So if you look at row A5, you can see we've started by reducing their outages by 35% in the first year, and we built that up to an 80% reduction by year 3. Then applying that percentage, applying those reduction rates to row A4, we can see that the total projected savings due to better stability and availability, that's on line AT, is a little over $6 million over the 3 years. So if you add together those 3 numbers in row AT, you get about $6 million. However, we also know that these estimates are based on a specific set of interviews with specific customers, right? It's not a huge set of hundreds of customers who answered this question. So it's possible that our interviewees were more likely than average to have P1 outages, or maybe they were less likely than average to have P1 outages. It's very difficult, as we know, to predict things like outages. It's also possible that their costs were higher than other customers, or possibly lower than other customers. So what we do here is we apply a risk adjustment. In this case, it's 20% to those numbers. Again, just to be conservative and recognize that the reader of the study may be in an organization with different parameters. So instead of the $6 million number, we used the 3-year total you see on row ATR, $4.95 million. You add up those 3 numbers on row ATR, and you'll see that comes to $4.95 million. Finally, though, we know there's also a time value to money, right? So $1 million in hand today is worth more to me than $1 million that I'm going to get 3 years from now, because I could be earning money on that $1 million during the 3 years. So we discount the total to recognize that. And that's where the $3,997,370 comes from. That's the final number that we're using for the value of this benefit. So I know that's a lot of detail, but hopefully it helps you to feel comfortable that the numbers we're working with have a basis in real customer experience, and they're also not overly inflated. In fact, they're pretty conservative. You can see also how you could use these numbers in your own exercise, right? Say you believe that you only have 3 P1 incidents per year, or maybe you think your costs are much higher than $250,000 an hour. You can run these same calculations and see what the value of this benefit would be to your organization and use that to build your own business case for deploying AVS. So as I said, I'm not going to go into as much detail on these other benefits, especially now that this one has a lot more rows on it. But you can see that that detail is still there, still available in the study for you to play around with. The biggest dollar impact benefit, $5.1 million for the organization, comes from decommissioning servers and even whole data centers after using AVS to move into Azure. This includes the cost of purchasing replacement servers and other equipment on a regular basis, the basic costs of the data centers themselves, such as colocation fees or building maintenance, power, and cooling costs. It also includes things like software updates and, very importantly, especially extended security updates, which all go away once the workloads are migrated to Azure with AVS. Now, we have assumed that some of this infrastructure remains at the end of the migration, because the organization will still probably have some data it wants or needs to keep on site, on premises, or it may repurpose that remaining infrastructure. So for instance, one of the interviewees told us that they were actually using that leftover infrastructure to upgrade their security infrastructure. So that's why you see we're projecting a 90% savings in the cost of ownership rather than the full 100,000. You can also see that the risk adjustment here is a little bit lower than in the previous example. So if you look down right above BTR, you'll see the risk adjustment here is 15% rather than the 20 that we had before. And that's because as we were talking to customers, they were much more confident about things like the number of servers they had and the amount of money they spent on extended security updates than they were about the number of P1 incidents or the cost of those incidents. So the risk here that these numbers are going to be different for other organizations is lower, and our risk adjustment is lower as well. We're still discounting the future savings to get the PV of, or the present value of, $5,083,121 you see in the lower right. The overall present value of the third benefit is $1,194,050. And it's primarily based on the organization being able to avoid hiring additional employees with the skills to modernize all their applications before migrating to Azure. Because the team can shift their workloads to the cloud without all the work of converting them for native Azure, they avoid the expense of either hiring additional headcount to come in and do that work. Because remember, one of the pain points these organizations pointed to was that they didn't have the required skills in-house to do this kind of modernization work. As the assistant director at a government department points out, though, it's not necessarily easy to find those people quickly, and especially if you need to ramp up a whole group at once. Of course, rather than hire additional talent, the organization could reskill their own IT team to be able to do that work, but that will delay their timetable. And that's time that most of the customers we spoke with didn't have. And it would still require a significant investment in reskilling. So based on the input we got from the companies we spoke with, we estimate that the organization would have had to hire 12 people over the course of 2 years to convert their applications for migration to the cloud. With AVS, that $1.2 million expense is avoided. One thing I just want to point out in this table is row C5. Whenever we include salary estimates in these calculations, we're talking about the fully burdened cost of that employee to the organization. So it's not just their direct salary, but it also includes the company's costs for benefits. And we generally assume that that is equal to about 35% of the stated salary. Finally, with the organization's workloads running in a more modern cloud environment on Azure, they can reduce the amount of time that the IT team spends on supporting outdated infrastructure. And that in itself is a savings of over $300,000. That time can be better spent, as the executive director of technology delivery at a healthcare organization stated, on supporting the business during busy times and devoting their talents to more value-added activities. As he said, we wanted to free up some of the people who were constantly devoting significant time to babysitting the hardware and the data center, even in our busiest time of year for open enrollment. Migrating our VMware workloads to the cloud with AVS accomplished that. So those are the 4 benefits that we quantified for this study. There were also a number of benefits that were, in many cases, equally important to the folks that we talked to, equally important to the organizations. But the interviewees just really weren't able to quantify them the way that we could with the others. So, as I mentioned, most of these firms were planning to undertake a modernization program after they migrated to the cloud. And being part of the Azure ecosystem provided them with easy access to technology and services that could help them do that. One interviewee likened it to building a house in a hardware store. When you realize you need a certain tool, it's right there for you. Interviewees also told us that the scalability provided by on-demand capacity would help make their organizations more flexible. So they could scale back on AVS nodes during slower periods and wouldn't have to pay for those, or they could scale up very quickly to take advantage of new opportunities. Also, the distributed nature of the cloud enabled the organizations to avoid catastrophic incidents and achieve faster recovery rates in cases where something did happen. And then finally, using AVS to get to the cloud accelerated innovation at these organizations. Interviewees agreed that Azure VMware Solution allowed their organizations to jumpstart their modernization journey with really very little effort and expense compared to other ways that might have been done. They felt much more prepared to take advantage of future opportunities as an organization because they had this work well underway. Now, of course, there's still no such thing as a free lunch. So there are some costs associated with using AVS to move to the cloud. Over the 3-year period of the model, the Composite organization actually incurred fees of $1.1 million for their Azure nodes, and they also spent $1.6 million on implementing the solution. So these included both the internal cost of the IT employees who spent time on the project, as well as the fees of a third-party partner to help. So I'll just show you those quickly. The calculation of the fees that the Composite organization pays for AVS is quite simple. It's just based on the estimate of the number of nodes the company will have in place as they migrate, and a cost per node per month of $3,500. Now, this is the list price from Microsoft, so it may be different from what your organization pays or would pay based on your relationship with Microsoft. And obviously, as you're doing your own business case, the best way to get the kind of estimate that you'll need for your purposes is to speak with your Microsoft rep. But you'll see that we apply here also the same idea of risk adjustment and present value to these numbers. And interestingly, because we're working on the cost side, when we adjust this by, in this case, 5% risk adjustment, we're actually adjusting the cost upward to be more conservative and compensate for that risk, rather than before when we were adjusting the value of the benefits down. And finally, we're not just including the direct cost of the technology in our calculations. We also look at the cost the organization pays to implement and maintain the solution. In this case, many customers told us that they hired a third party to assist in their deployment and migration, in combination with people from their own technical team. So based on those interviews, we projected $1.375 million in cost for a tech services provider to accomplish a project of this size. And we also included 5 internal technicians devoting half their time to the project for 6 months. And the whole cost here is realized up front. So you'll see there's a column here labeled initial, which is not on the benefit side because we don't get any benefits before we actually launch or deploy AVS. But we do have costs before we deploy AVS. And that's what these represent. So that whole cost is realized up front before the benefits are coming in years 1 through 3. And that is the total economic impact of Azure VMware Solution. As I mentioned up front, it's a 298% return on the investment in implementing AVS. And as you can see from the cash flow chart, we have a negative investment in that initial period, but immediately in the first year, you see that green line crossing the bars, and that's showing that the investment is paying off already in the first year. In fact, in about 6 months. Thanks again for your time and attention today. I hope this has given you a good sense of the kind of impact that Azure VMware Solution may have on your organization. And go download that full study to learn even more.